And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook. It is Wednesday, July 3rd, and this outlook will be for Thursday, July 4th and Friday. We start out with the sea ice, and the ice continues to gradually melt off across the Chukchi Sea and along the Arctic coast, though at a slower rate. We do have some pretty good openings there within the water in the lower Chukchi Sea and the area there near and just west of Point Ley. And the ice will just continue to slowly melt as we head through the remainder of the summer, though there will be a bit of a cooling trend. The trend coming up here now through mid-month, middle of July, is for temperatures to average below normal here along this area of the northwest coast, all the way down toward the southwest areas into the eastern Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula. But of note, we have a push of milder air coming in off of the Bering Sea. This system has brought some moderate to locally heavy rain along the west coast as well as in through the western interior, and that moisture will be spreading eastward as we go through overnight and into the day on Thursday, July 4th. Also, breezy conditions could cause some elevated surf levels along Norton Sound in areas of the west-northwest coast, extending up along the lower Chukchi Sea coastline, especially from around and south of Point Hope. The frontal system that has drifted southward is going to kind of slow down and wash out here across the central interior, but the good news is it's bringing cooler temperatures, and along with wetting rains, it will greatly reduce the fire weather threat here as we go through the long holiday weekend. And on Thursday, 4th of July, we have a weak ridge of high pressure centered over the northern Gulf. And this is the trough that's what's left of that cool front. And then as the push of milder air works its way inland, it kind of stalls out here over the western mainland and extends back down toward the eastern Aleutians. But there will be a fair amount of rain along this system here along the west side of the state, also traversing through the interior. So again, greatly reducing the fire threat. And some of the rain now through early weekend, through Saturday, areas here along the west coast, especially in the western interior along the southwest slope here of the Brooks Range, areas just east of the Seward Peninsula could pick up 2-4 inches of rain. And by the time we get into Friday, there'll be another push of rain coming up along the Alaska Peninsula into Cook Inlet that could bring some steadier rain to the Anchorage area for Friday evening into Saturday. But in the meantime, I think across the Panhandle, overall the trend will be for drying conditions here for the weekend, and it's going to get warmer. In the meantime, still a few scattered light showers central northern Panhandle for Thursday, 4th of July. Kind of a mixed bag of winds. Northwest 15 knots, 2-3 foot waves, Ketchikan, Metlakatla down toward Dixon Entrance. South winds 10 to 15 knots, waves 2 to 3 feet. Stevens Passage up through Lynn Canal. And then the outer Gulf Coast winds are going to be west-northwest 10 to 15 knots with swells 3-4 feet. And for Friday, look for winds to be still northwest 15 knots there, Dixon Entrance, 3-foot waves. Southwest winds to 10 knots with Stevens Passage with a couple of foot waves, and 2 to 3 foot waves with southerly winds at 15 knots there along the length of Lynn Canal. For the outer coast, generally west winds right around 15 knots with swells 4 to maybe as high as 5 feet. For the northwestern Gulf, southwest winds 10 knots within Prince William Sound, 2-foot waves. Outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance and off the Kenai coast, southwest winds to 15 knots with 3-foot swells. That'll be the case also at the entrance of Cook Inlet, but some stronger winds to 25 knots there, middle upper Cook Inlet, especially off and northwest of Anchor Point with waves as high as 5 to 8 feet. And then for Friday, we're looking at within Prince William Sound, south winds to 10 knots, 2-foot waves. South-southwest winds 15 knots outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance all the way down to northeast of Kodiak Island with swells of 4 to 6 feet. Southeast winds still at 15 knots there at the entrance of Cook Inlet with 3-4 foot swells. And then south winds at 20 knots off of Anchor Point all the way on up to north of Kenai with waves of 4 to 5 feet. Winds will be southwesterly at 15 to 20 knots across Kodiak Island on the 4th of July. 6-foot waves within Shelikof Strait, then variable winds trailing out through the middle peninsula at 10 knots with waves just a couple of feet or so. and south-southwest winds to 15 knots through the lower portion of the Alaska Peninsula. And for Friday, still south-southwest winds 15 to 20 knots there surrounding Kodiak Island. Variable winds on the North Pacific side, southwest of Akiak and east of Chignik and Sand Point, where waves only be a couple of feet. Southwest winds into Bristol Bay and westerly winds 15 knots or so, Cold Bay on up to Bristol Bay with swells of 3 to 4 feet. Eastern Aleutians will see south-southwest winds 15 to 20 knots as we get further west. Winds become more southerly west of Adak at 20 to 25 knots. And on Friday, winds rather light, especially once we get west of on Alaska toward Nikolsky, variable winds around 10 knots. And then once you get west of there, central and western Aleutians will see southwest to south winds 15 to 20 knots. And along the southwest coast, southwest winds 20 knots into Bristol Bay, south winds to 25 knots into Kuskokwim Bay, where swells could be upwards around 5 feet. Southwest winds 20 knots, St. Matthew down through the Pribilof Islands, waves 8-9 feet there, and a pretty good southwesterly flow to 25 knots along the lower Yukon coastline and up into Norton Sound, where there could be some elevated surf levels as a result of these stiffer southwest winds. And for Friday, still southwest winds 20 to 25 knots along the lower Yukon Delta into the Norton Sound. Southwest winds to 30 knots out there at St. Matthew, and then southwest winds 15 to 20 knots into Bristol and Kuskokwim Bays. And as we take a look here at the Bering Strait, winds will be generally south at 20 knots, picking upwards to 25 knots off of Point Hope and Cape Lisburne. And there's a fair amount of open water within this area of the lower Chukchi Sea, so swells could be 4 or 5 feet there. Still a fair amount of ice along the Arctic coast, Utqiagvik to Kaktovik, where westerly winds will prevail at 15 to 20 knots. And for Friday, look for generally southerly winds, winds with a southerly component to 10 knots along the Arctic coast. And as we drop down through the Chukchi Sea, generally south winds around 20 knots, though they could be as high as 30 knots coming through the Bering Strait, and then on the north side of St. Lawrence Island and along the west side of the Seward Peninsula, we're looking for south to southwest winds at about 25 knots with waves or swells around 6 feet.